Light Yagami and Minoru Tanaka are characters from the Death Note universe. One day, Light comes across the Death Note and resolves to utilize it to establish a new world devoid of criminals. He murdered many people in order to keep the Death Note and avoid suspicion, as well as to shift his moral compass. What began as a desire to kill criminals evolved into a desire to kill everyone who dared to resist him. Light was eventually defeated, and life returned to normal. However, the cycle was repeated subsequently, but with a slight twist. Ryuk, the possessor of Light's Death Note, handed it to Minoru Tanaka, Japan's current smartest middle schooler. Instead of killing criminals, Minoru decided to sell the Death Note to the highest bidder. Many may believe that Light was more wicked than Minoru because he continuously killed and manipulated not just criminals, but also innocent individuals who were simply attempting to stop him. Yet Minoru's use of the Death Note was not for good reasons. Greed was a sole motivator. So, which was the more evil of the two? What is the significance of Light's use of the Death Note? What were his reasons for doing it? Light, angered by the world's injustices, uses the Death Note to kill people he considers morally undeserving of life, masterminding a worldwide massacre as the psychopathic vigilante Kira. Light's goals, while seemingly pure, are not as altruistic as they appear. Light was nurtured by a loving family and a loving town, where everyone praised and extolled him as an ideal student, son, and all-around guy. But all of that praise and endearment is all he's ever known after all. So looking at his motivations, he idolizes his father and wants to live up to his selfless and heroic standards and strong moral compass. He, following from his father's code, believed killing to be wrong. But does he actually believe this? When Light obtains Death Note, he inadvertently murders someone while testing it. To be sure, he kills someone again, this time an innocent person, at least in the manga, and then he absolutely cracks. Light turns into the very thing he despises, and we are no longer perfect or heroic. So, instead of admitting his error and working to be better himself, as he should have done if he was truly as virtuous as he thought, he continues to murder others in an attempt to convince himself that he's still in the right. His skilled sense of justice causes him to truly believe that death is a reasonable penalty for laziness near the end, and things would have only grown worse from there. So, how does someone with that much power and intelligence fail? Light was extinguished because he and the individuals he surrounded himself with the exception of Ryuk, were human, which is a regrettable aspect of life. Light's first fatal error was murdering Lind L. Taylor. Light murdered a man he thought was innocent for the first time. This demonstrated to L that Kira was human, a human he was mortal enough to be alarmed by a man on television. This also demonstrated that Kira's abilities were supernatural. Another deadly error of his ties in with the first, leading Kira's principles to deteriorate. He abandons his pursuit of justice and enters the cat and mouse game, killing numerous innocent people along the way. One could argue that if Light had just kept killing criminals, he would not have been apprehended. How could he have been charged if everyone believed Kira was a god? Killing the innocents who tried to apprehend him only guaranteed his demise. Even with such gaffes, Light was wise enough to come out on top. So it was the fact that he relied way too much on others that caused him to fail. He was very reliant on Misa and her notebook. Misa, the person responsible for the Death Note's discovery. He was overly reliant on the task force. Even without considering their mistrust of Light, they leaked too much information, which contributed to his demise. Aizawa, for example, was reporting the Nier for the first time. He alleged that during Sojiro's automobile journey, while testing the suspects in L's capacity, Sojiro remarked that he would kill the suspect, then kill himself. This led Nier to conclude that the individual suspected by L was Sojiro's child. This led Nier to discover the identity of the second L. He placed far too much trust in Mikami, which was the only reason Light's last strategy failed. Light gave him strong orders not to use the real Death Note, but Mikami disregarded him, believing that by killing Takada, he would be able to help Kira. This allowed Nier's detective to locate and steal the real notebook, putting Light in a difficult situation. Light chose to use the Death Note to construct his ideal world, at the expense of thousands of people, many of whom were innocent. But were those sacrifices in vain? Kira's judgment gained traction after L died. Kira's impact on the globe was divided, with some fearing him and others worshipping him. Certain countries, like the United States of America, began to recognize Kira's decision. According to Light in Death Note chapter 105, it has been 6 years since Kira arrived, and since then, war has become a thing of the past. Most of the worst criminals have died, and the world's crime rate has gone down 70%. However, the finale of Death Note indicated that crime began to grow again after Light's death. This appears to be declaration about how Kira was acquired, but the characters also considered it an indication that Kira failed. Light acquired a god complex at the height of his dominance, believing that he was altering the world and building a devoted power base while also erasing the concept of crime. The spike in crime following his death demonstrates that his acts had no long-term consequences. His devoted followers all returned to their lives, and people simply opt to carry on as they had before the events of the series. Nia made this statement near the end of Death Note. Everything that transpired was caused by the Death Note, and Light was merely a guy who got carried away with its power. Light did in some ways change the world, but it did not last. Minoru's acts were driven by greed, to put it simply. He didn't want to kill criminals like his predecessor. He had no desire to do so. After obtaining the Death Note from Ryuk and contemplating his options, he decided to sell it. Unlike Light, who claimed to use his geniuses to execute those who deserved it, Minoru decided to utilize his brilliant intellect to meet his own desires. It's amusing since there is a resemblance between Light and Minoru that has to do with their ages. Light was 17 when he picked up the Death Note, and he hadn't fully matured throughout that time. Even though he was brilliant, he still had a childlike vision of the world, which he unleashed on the world by killing criminals as Kira. Minoru, on the other hand, encountered Ryuk and the Death Note while still in middle school, during which time he will be 16 or 17 and still not fully mature. Minoru admits at the eldest that he's kind of dumb and merely really excellent at riddles. He most likely thought the situation through thoroughly, but he didn't consider the consequences, only the solution. In that sense, it may be viewed as a criticism of the Japanese educational system. Regardless, he must have realized the potentially disastrous consequences of handing over the Death Note to a superpower. He's not that stupid, he simply didn't care. The scheme to sell the Death Note failed and succeeded at the same time. What I mean is that it was successful because 1 quadrillion yen was distributed to Japanese residents, as Minoru intended. It failed, however, since the Shinigami King created a new rule that stated a human who buys or sells the Death Note in the human world will die. When the seller receives the money, they will die, and the buyer will die when they receive the notebook. As a result, the President of the United States was unable to receive the power of the Death Note. Receive the power of the Death Note. The same Death Note that Ni called the worst weapon of mass murder in history. Minoru granted the United States the capacity to kill practically anyone on the earth instantly and invisibly, and evidently didn't care about the consequences. The Death Note is a power that no person should be granted. The list of things that the United States of America could have gotten away with is infinite. They could assassinate any foreign leader who was not obedient to them in a matter of minutes. Regime changes would occur in a moment. Soldiers would no longer be forced to shoot their adversaries. Instead, they will be required to capture photographs and send them to their superiors. And that's not even the worst part. Light Yagami was driven by a desire for justice, a perverted sort of justice that became increasingly distorted over time. But he was still functioning on some level of morality. He was also quite narcissistic and desired to be seen and noticed because he enjoyed competing with the investigators. The US government is typically motivated by money, and they have no obligation to play fair in the same manner that Light did. I don't want to go political, but they've engaged in more than a fair share of immoral operations for wealth, resources, and geopolitical dominance. That is something I believe we can all agree on. With the power of a Death Note in their hand, all of that will go into overdrive. All they'd have to say is, hand over the reins to your country, or we'll kill 1,000 civilians every day. That's all there is to it. Moreover, unlike Light Yagami, the government is not required to murder solely by cardiac arrest. They can kill anyone they want and no one will ever know if they were involved. Finally, the Death Note has a demonstrable corrupting influence on those who use it. Simply because of human psychology, the power it possesses is addictive. The only moral application of the Death Note is to throw it in the sun. Whatever you think of the existing American administration, the Death Note would exaggerate it tremendously. Evil is manipulative rather than addictive. Given that an endless amount of pages may be removed from the Death Note without losing its power, it's entirely likely that fragments of the notebook would spread like wildfire across the entire country, which would ultimately result in the death of humanity if every country pointed their nuclear weapons at the US and the US did the same. And by extension, the extermination of all Shinigami. What if an additional Shinigami decides to sell the Death Note? Sure, it will murder both the buyer and the seller. But what if the Shinigami specifically targets someone whose family is deeply in debt? Someone suffering from a terminal illness? Or even both? What if the buyer in another government is someone in the same position? Sure, Minoru died, but no one else in Japan who received the money did. And if Ryuk was telling the truth, only Trump would have died, not the entire US administration. Now we have a scenario in which every country might have a Death Note, and all of the problems that I highlighted as a result of only the United States having one. No mutually asserted destruction does not apply because the Death Note has the ability to act invisibly. So basically, humanity's demise, but much faster this time. Minoru may not be as outwardly hostile as Light, but he's just as blinkered and, at worst, cruelly and suicidally self-centered. Sure, he could have done it out of compassion, but it's also plausible that he did it because it was the only way he could earn his pay without calling attention to himself. Even if his intentions were good, it just means he's pulling a funny Valentine, boosting his country while screwing over everyone else. Even if Japan isn't now on America's geopolitical kill list, that doesn't mean they won't turn on them at some point. Attempting to sell the world's most lethal weapon of mass murder to the same nation that had already used the second on his own homeland was maybe not the best idea. Minoru's actions, while vastly different from Light's, may have resulted in a global nuclear catastrophe. So, which of the two is the more evil of the two? Yagami in the Light, self-proclaimed god of the New World who killed an unknown but likely large number of convicts who were not given a fair trial, mixed in with some innocents who were simply trying to stop him. Is it Minoru Tanaka, the man who wanted to sell the Death Note but didn't care about the consequences and was simply motivated by greed? In terms of good and wrong, there is some moral ambiguity, which Light fails to recognize throughout the series. Objectively, we as a society have evolved far beyond the eye for an eye model of justice because we have recognized that humans have the capacity for change and in many situations deserve it. Killing criminals is akin to claiming that you can cure cancer by simply chopping off whatever has cancer with a butcher's cleaver. If you want to heal crime, you must look at what causes it rather than who commits it. For a high school educated kid, it is understandable to see the world in such black and white ways. But to continue it through a college education that had to have been focused around the criminal justice system as he became a cop, he had to be either stupid or stubborn to ignore what he learned. Things like poverty, income inequality, gaps, etc. tend to be at the root of a lot of crime. The logical progression of his plan should have been something like: first year, kill criminals. Establish the global power of the book. Learn about global politics and policies. Push enforcement of higher criminal standards onto the nation with the threat of a death of higher-ups. Learn about economics. Possibly enforce some sort of max and min wage gap. Say like 50k to 200k, with anything under being subsidized and anything over going towards fighting poverty, charity, research to improve humanity. Then go after large corporations, again with the threat of death with the background killing of criminals. To be sure that things like food, water, medicine, all things that are essential are readily available to everyone everywhere. When people want for less, they tend to commit less crimes. Granted, you'll still have the occasional person who does it for other reasons, but they tend to be the minority. The fact that he was doing most of the legwork rather than exploiting people in positions of power and influence spoke to his god complex and naivety with the way the world works. Light's intelligence was quite mechanical in nature, and he could predict movements and interactions many steps ahead of what others would ordinarily think, much like a chess player. His practical intelligence, on the other hand, was quite abysmal or probably disregarded due to his sociopathic tendencies / god complex. He never matured as a character, especially for someone we followed through such a pivotal period in most people's lives. To most people, attempting to alter the world without first knowing how the world and its people work would seem ridiculous. Human psychology, behavioral science, politics, economics, and other subjects would have helped him in his efforts to create a new and better society with the power he possessed. However, in the end, he was nothing more than a youngster sitting atop an anthill, burning ants with a magnifying glass and occasionally exploding in wrath when bitten, but never trying to consider why. Minoru Tanaka, as brilliant as he is, lacks insight in contrast. Minoru was still quite young at the time and was unaware of the consequences of his conduct. I feel that if someone had told Minoru about all of the events that could occur as a result of selling the Death Note, he would have either backed out or devised a new strategy that would not result in such tragic consequences.